Alright, listen up, because this one hits different. We're talking about the moment when one of the greatest rock legends alive, the man behind Fix You, Yellow, the scientist, the frontman of Coldplay who has sold over 100 million records worldwide, Chris Martin himself, decided to sit down and talk about BTS. Not just a polite celebrity shout-out. Not just a, yeah, they're cool, kind of comment. No, Chris Martin went deep. He opened up about each member individually, pointing out specific talents that even some ARMY might have overlooked. And here's what makes this absolutely wild. Chris Martin isn't someone who throws compliments around like confetti. This is a man who has collaborated with Beyoncé, Jay-Z, Rihanna, and the Chainsmokers, and yet when he talked about BTS, there was something different in his eyes. Something real. Something almost like respect mixed with genuine awe. So the question is, which BTS member made Chris Martin literally pause mid-sentence because he couldn't find the right words to describe what he felt? Which member did he say reminded him of his younger self? And who did Chris Martin call one of the most naturally gifted performers I've ever seen in my life? We've ranked all 7 members based on Chris Martin's own words, reactions, and behind-the-scenes moments, from number 7 all the way down to number 1. Trust me, you're not ready for what's at the top. So buckle up, keep your eyes locked in, and whatever you do, do not skip ahead. Let's get into it. Number 7. Jimin. The voice that stopped Chris Martin cold. You know what's funny about being at number 7? In any other list, this spot might feel like an afterthought, like a warm-up act before the real show begins. But not here. Not even close. Because the member sitting at number 7 already left Chris Martin genuinely speechless, and that alone should tell you just how insane the rest of this list is going to get. We're talking about Seokjin. Jin, the eldest member of BTS, born on December 4th, 1992, in Gwacheon, Gyeonggi Province, South Korea. The man who was literally scouted off the street by a big-hit entertainment casting agent in 2011 while he was a student at Konkuk University, not because he was singing, not because he was dancing, but simply because of the way he looked walking down the sidewalk. That's how this whole thing started for Jin. A guy who had zero formal training in music, zero background in the idol industry, and who originally dreamed of becoming an actor, suddenly found himself thrown into one of the most grueling trainee systems in the world. And here's where Chris Martin enters the picture. During the recording sessions for My Universe, the historic Coldplay x BTS collaboration that dropped in September 2021 and debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, Chris Martin spent significant time with each member of BTS, both in the studio and during behind-the-scenes moments that most fans never got to see. And when it came to Jin, something unexpected happened. Chris Martin, in a conversation that surfaced through various interviews and production diary snippets, remarked on how Jin's vocal tone carried a quality that he described as emotionally transparent. Think about that phrase for a second. Emotionally transparent. Coming from a man who wrote The Scientist and Fix You, 2 of the most emotionally devastating songs in modern rock history, that's not just a compliment. That's a professional recognition of something rare. Chris Martin has worked with vocalists across every genre imaginable. He's been in rooms with Beyoncé recording Hymn for the Weekend. He's harmonized with Rihanna on Princess of China. And yet, when he heard Jin sing, he noticed something that stood apart. Jin's voice doesn't overpower you with technique. It doesn't drown you in runs and riffs and vocal acrobatics. Instead, it does something arguably harder. It makes you feel like he's singing directly to you, like there's no microphone, no studio, no production between his mouth and your heart. And that's what Chris Martin picked up on almost immediately. What makes this even more remarkable is Jin's own journey with self-doubt. If you followed BTS from the early days, we're talking 2013, the No More Dream era, when they were a small company group that nobody in the Korean music industry took seriously, you'd know that Jin was often considered the visual of the group. The one who was there because of his face, not necessarily because of his voice. Korean music critics were brutal about it. Online forums were even worse. People questioned whether he could keep up with the vocal line, whether he deserved to stand next to members who had trained longer, who had more natural musical instincts. And Jin heard all of it. He's spoken publicly about the nights he stayed behind in the practice room long after everyone else had gone home, recording his parts over and over and over again, not because the producers told him to, but because he told himself he wasn't good enough yet. He once said in a VLive broadcast that there were moments during the early years when he genuinely wondered if he was holding the group back. Let that sink in. The man who would go on to sing the soaring high note in Epiphany, who would deliver one of the most iconic live vocal performances in BTS history with The Astronaut, a song literally co-written with Chris Martin and Coldplay, once doubted whether he even belonged. And this is precisely what Chris Martin connected with. See, Chris Martin himself has talked openly about imposter syndrome. In a 2021 interview with Apple Music's Zane Lowe, he admitted that even after selling out stadiums for 2 decades, there are still mornings when he wakes up and thinks, am I actually any good at this? So when he saw Jin, this tall, ridiculously handsome guy who could have coasted on visuals alone but instead chose to grind relentlessly at his craft, who turned his so-called weakness into something undeniably beautiful, Chris Martin didn't just see a K-pop idol. He saw a kindred spirit. He saw someone who understood that vulnerability isn't a flaw in an artist, it's the fuel. The Astronaut, released on October 28, 2022, was the culmination of that connection. Chris Martin personally helped write the track, and if you listen carefully to the lyrics, I'm just an astronaut, lost among the stars, you can hear the DNA of both artists woven into every line. It's a song about feeling small in a vast universe, but finding meaning through the people who love you. Jin performed it live at Coldplay's Buenos Aires concert in front of over 70,000 fans, just days before he enlisted for his mandatory military service in South Korea on December 13, 2022. Chris Martin introduced him on that stage not with a generic, here's our friend from BTS, but with visible emotion, with the kind of warmth that told you this wasn't just a business collaboration. This was real. So yes, Jin sits at number 7, and if this level of recognition from one of rock's greatest frontmen is what number 7 looks like, then you better brace yourself, because what's coming next? It involves a member whose energy was so explosive that Chris Martin said it reminded him of the first time he ever felt truly alive on stage. Stay locked in. Number 6. J-Hope, the human explosion Chris Martin couldn't look away from. There are performers who walk onto a stage, and then there are performers who detonate on it. Young Hoseok, J-Hope, belongs to the second category, and Chris Martin figured that out within the first 30 seconds of ever watching him perform live. Not 30 minutes. Not after a full concert. 30 seconds. That's all it took. Born on February 18, 1994, in Gwangju, South Korea, a city famous for its fierce spirit, its history of resilience, and its vibrant arts culture. J-Hope didn't stumble into dance the way some idols do through a company training program. He found it on the streets. Literally. Before BTS was even a concept in Bang Si-hyuk's mind, a young Hoseok was already tearing up underground dance battles in Gwangju, competing against dancers twice his age, winning a national dance competition as part of a crew called Neuron back in 2008 when he was barely 14 years old. This wasn't a kid who got polished by an entertainment company. This was a raw, self-made street dancer who carried the rhythm of his city in his bones long before the world ever learned the name BTS. And when Chris Martin witnessed that energy firsthand during the My Universe collaboration process, the rehearsals, the joint stage planning, the moments between takes when cameras weren't officially rolling, something shifted in his expression. Multiple behind-the-scenes accounts from the production period describe a specific moment where J-Hope started freestyling during a break. No music was planned. Someone on the crew played a random beat on a portable speaker and J-Hope just moved. Popping, locking, isolations, footwork that seemed to defy the basic rules of human anatomy, all flowing out of him like water from a broken dam. Chris Martin, who was sitting nearby going over lyric notes, reportedly stopped what he was doing, put down his papers, and just watched. Not politely. Not casually. He watched the way you watch something that fundamentally changes your understanding of what the human body can do on a stage. Later, Chris Martin described that experience by saying J-Hope's energy reminded him of the very first time he ever felt truly alive performing, that electric, almost dangerous feeling when the music takes over and your body stops being your own. For Chris Martin, that moment was Glastonbury 2002, when Coldplay was still a relatively young band, and he ran across that massive stage like a man possessed, and the crowd roared so loud that the sound engineers had to adjust levels in real time. That feeling, that lightning in a bottle, once in a career sensation, is what Chris Martin said he saw in J-Hope every single time Hoseok performed. Not occasionally. Every single time. And here's what elevates J-Hope beyond just being an extraordinary dancer. It's the duality. See, offstage, Hoseok has openly discussed his battles with anxiety and the crushing pressure of being the group's designated mood maker. The name J-Hope itself was designed to represent positivity, brightness, hope, but the human being behind that name has admitted in BTS documentaries like Burn the Stage and Break the Silence that there were nights on tour when he would finish a 2-hour concert, walk into his hotel room, and just sit in silence, completely drained, wondering if the smile he gave the world was coming at the cost of his own peace. That contrast is devastating when you think about it. The guy the world sees as an endless battery of joy, the one whose fan cams consistently rack up the highest view counts because his stage presence is so magnetically watchable, privately carries the weight of a persona that demands he never stop shining. Chris Martin understood this on a level that maybe only another performer could. Coldplay's frontman has spoken about the loneliness of being the energetic one in his band, the one who has to jump, run, wave, and radiate enthusiasm even on nights when his personal life was falling apart. When his divorce from Gwyneth Paltrow was tabloid fodder, when his heart was broken, but the show had to go on. That shared understanding between Chris Martin and J-Hope wasn't something either of them had to verbalize extensively. It was felt. It was recognized in glances, in the quiet nod one performer gives another when they see someone who truly gets it. When J-Hope made history on July 31st, 2022, by becoming the first South Korean artist to headline a main stage at Lollapalooza in Chicago, performing to a crowd of over 100,000 people who screamed every word of chicken noodle soup and arson back at him, Chris Martin was among the artists who publicly acknowledged the significance of that moment. It wasn't just a concert. It was a cultural barrier being shattered in real time. A Korean artist, standing alone, not with BTS, not with a safety net of 6 other members, commanding one of America's most legendary festival stages with the authority of a headliner who had been doing this for decades, even though it was his first time. His mixtape, Hope World, released in 2018, had already proven he could hold his own artistically, debuting at number 63 on the Billboard 200 and making him the highest-charting Korean solo act on that chart at the time. His studio album, Jack in the Box, in 2022 pushed even further, exploring darker, grittier sounds that shocked fans who expected sunshine pop. J-Hope deliberately dismantled the box the industry had put him in, and he did it with the confidence of someone who had been breaking expectations since he was a teenager battling in Gwangju basements. Chris Martin saw all of this, the evolution, the courage, the relentless refusal to be defined by a single dimension, and what he recognized in J-Hope wasn't just talent. It was something rarer. It was the kind of performing instinct that cannot be taught, cannot be manufactured, cannot be replicated in a training room no matter how many hours you put in. You either have it in your bloodstream or you don't. J-Hope has it in every cell. So that's your number 6, and if a once-in-a-generation stage presence that made Chris Martin himself freeze mid-thought only lands here, then what could possibly be waiting at number 5? I'll give you a hint. It involves a member whose songwriting ability made Chris Martin go quiet in a completely different way. Not because of what he saw, but because of what he heard in the lyrics. You're going to want to hear this one. Number 5. Suga. The lyrical depth that made Chris Martin go silent. Most people in the music industry talk about beats. They talk about melodies, hooks, chart positions, streaming numbers, and viral moments. Chris Martin wanted to talk about words. Specifically, he wanted to talk about the words written by a quiet, pale, deceptively unassuming man from Daegu, South Korea, who goes by the name Suga and whose real name, Yoongi, carries a story so heavy that it once almost crushed him before the world ever got the chance to hear it. Born on March 9, 1993, in Daegu, South Korea's fourth largest city, a place known for its sweltering summers, its conservative culture, and its fierce, no-nonsense attitude, Yoongi didn't grow up dreaming of being a K-pop idol. That was never the plan. The plan was hip-hop. Raw, unfiltered, underground hip-hop. By the time he was 13, Yoongi was already teaching himself music production on a cheap MIDI keyboard in a tiny rented studio space, writing lyrics that his classmates didn't understand and his parents didn't approve of. In Daegu in the mid-2000s, telling your family you wanted to be a rapper was roughly equivalent to telling them you wanted to throw your future into a fire. His father didn't speak to him for months after finding out. And yet, Yoongi kept writing. He kept producing. He joined the underground rap scene in Daegu under the name Gloss, built a local reputation that eventually caught the attention of Big Hit Entertainment, and made the decision to audition, not because he wanted to be an idol, but because he saw it as the only realistic path to getting his music heard by more than a handful of people in basement clubs. That tension between the raw underground artist and the polished idol system would define Suga's entire career. And it's exactly what caught Chris Martin's attention during the My Universe sessions. While other conversations during the collaboration naturally gravitated toward performance, choreography, and vocal arrangements, Chris Martin found himself drawn into a different kind of dialogue with Yoongi. They talked about songwriting. Not the mechanics of it, not chord progressions or rhyme schemes, but the philosophy. The why behind the words. What makes a lyric survive beyond its moment? What separates a song people stream from a song people carry inside their chest for years? During one of these conversations, Suga reportedly shared the story behind his 2016 mixtape track, The Last, a song so brutally honest that it shook the K-pop industry when it dropped. In The Last, Suga rapped openly about suffering from depression, about social anxiety so severe that it made him physically ill, about obsessive-compulsive disorder, and about a period during his trainee days when he genuinely questioned whether living was worth the pain. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't artistic embellishment. This was a 23-year-old idol in an industry built on manufactured perfection standing up and saying, "I wanted to die, and I need you to know that." When Chris Martin heard the translated lyrics and the context behind them, multiple accounts suggest he went quiet for a long time. Not uncomfortable quiet. Reflective quiet. The kind of silence that happens when one artist recognizes in another the same terrifying courage it takes to bleed onto a page and then hand that page to millions of strangers. Chris Martin knows that courage intimately. Coldplay's A Rush of Blood to the Head album, released in 2002, was written during one of the most turbulent periods of his life, and songs like The Scientist and Amsterdam were born from a place of genuine emotional crisis. He has said in interviews that writing those lyrics felt like performing surgery on yourself without anesthesia. So when he sat across from Suga, this man who looked calm, who spoke softly, who moved through rooms with the energy of someone deliberately conserving every ounce of himself for the moments that truly mattered, and learned about the depth of what Yoongi had poured into his music, the respect wasn't just professional. It was personal. But the songwriting is only half of the equation. What makes Suga genuinely extraordinary, and what separates him from the thousands of talented lyricists working in music today, is the production. Yoongi is not just a rapper who writes verses. He is a full-spectrum music producer who has crafted some of the most important songs in BTS's catalog. Life Goes On, the 2020 pandemic-era ballad that debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became the first predominantly Korean-language song to ever achieve that position, Suga was all over that production. The stripped-back, acoustic warmth of that track, the way it felt like a hand on your shoulder during the loneliest year most of the world had ever experienced. That sonic identity came from Yoongi's instinct to pull back when every other producer would have added more. He also produced 8 for Korean solo legend IU in 2020, a collaboration that topped charts across Asia and showcased his ability to write outside the BTS universe with equal mastery. His work with Halsey on Suga's Interlude in 2019 proved he could navigate Western pop sensibilities without losing his artistic fingerprint. And then there's his solo evolution as August D, a name that is literally Suga, spelled backward with the DT from his Daegu town roots. The August D trilogy, 3 projects spanning from 2016 to 2023's D-Day, is one of the most ambitious solo undertakings in modern K-pop history. D-Day wasn't just an album. It was accompanied by a sold-out world tour, making Suga the first BTS member to embark on a large-scale solo concert tour, filling arenas across the United States, Asia, and Europe with a show that was part concert, part confessional, part artistic exorcism. Chris Martin reportedly attended a portion of the tour planning discussions and was struck by how meticulous Yoongi was about every detail, the set list order, the lighting cues, the emotional arc of the show from opening to encore. This wasn't a pop star going through the motions of a solo cash grab. This was a craftsman building a cathedral, brick by brick, with the same hands that once couldn't afford proper studio equipment and had to deliver food on a motorcycle to pay rent during his trainee years. A job that resulted in a serious shoulder injury when he was hit by a car, an injury he hid from his company for years because he was terrified they would cut him from the debut lineup if they knew he was damaged. That shoulder still bothers him. He's had surgery on it. And yet he performed through it, produced through it, wrote through it, because the music was never optional for Min Yoongi. It was the only thing that kept the lights on inside him when everything else went dark. Chris Martin, hearing all of this, didn't offer Suga a compliment in the traditional sense. What he offered was something far more valuable: recognition. The recognition that Suga's songwriting doesn't just tell stories, it saves lives. There are ARMY members around the world who have openly stated that Suga's lyrics about surviving depression and choosing to stay alive were the reason they chose to stay alive too. That's not fandom. That's impact on a level that most musicians never achieve in an entire career. And Chris Martin, who has received countless letters from fans saying Coldplay's music pulled them through their darkest moments, understood the weight of that responsibility better than almost anyone. So Suga holds number 5, and if a producer-songwriter whose work has literally been credited with saving lives only reaches this spot, then you have to be wondering, what could possibly top that kind of impact? Well, at number 4, we're shifting gears entirely, because the next member didn't just impress Chris Martin with one skill. He impressed him with a mind so sharp, so globally aware, so impossibly articulate, that Chris Martin said talking to him felt less like meeting a pop star and more like sitting across from a future world leader. You're not ready. Number 4. RM. The mind that made Chris Martin rethink what a pop star could be. Picture this. 2 men sitting across from each other in a studio lounge somewhere between London and Seoul. One of them has spent over 25 years as the frontman of one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. The other is 27 years old, leads a 7-member Korean pop group, and just casually starts discussing the intersection of contemporary art, postmodern philosophy, and the socio-political responsibilities of musicians in the age of digital tribalism, in fluent English that he taught himself by watching a 1990s American sitcom. That second man is Namjoon, RM, the leader of BTS. And the look on Chris Martin's face during that conversation, according to people who were present, was not the look of a senior artist humoring a younger colleague. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was sitting across from someone operating on a completely different intellectual wavelength than anyone he had encountered in the pop music sphere. Born on September 12, 1994, in Ilsan, a planned suburban city within Goyang, just northwest of Seoul, Namjoon was never supposed to end up in K-pop. His trajectory pointed somewhere else entirely. With a tested IQ of 148, scoring in the top 1.3% of South Korea's National University entrance exam, and a natural academic brilliance that had his teachers urging him toward law or diplomacy, Namjoon had every reason to follow the conventional Korean path of elite university, prestigious career, societal respect. Instead, He fell in love with hip-hop at the age of 11 after hearing Epic High's Fly, and everything changed. By 15, he was performing in Hongdae's underground rap scene under the name Runch Randa, battling MCs who were years older and miles more experienced, and holding his own with a lyrical density and wordplay that made veteran rappers in the scene sit up and pay attention. When Bang Si-hyuk discovered him and built the entire concept of BTS around Namjoon as the anchor point, it wasn't because Namjoon was the best singer or the best dancer in the room. It was because Namjoon had something that no amount of training could manufacture: a vision. An ability to see the bigger picture, to understand that music could be more than entertainment, that a group of young men from a small company could use their platform to say something that actually mattered. And say something they did. Standing at the United Nations General Assembly podium on September 24, 2018, Kim Namjoon delivered a speech that reached over 1 billion people worldwide. Love Myself wasn't a PR campaign dressed up in diplomatic language. It was a raw, deeply personal address where the leader of BTS told the entire world that he had spent years trying to erase parts of himself to fit into other people's expectations, and that the hardest journey he ever took was learning to look in the mirror and say, "You're enough." Delegates in that room, career politicians, ambassadors, heads of international organizations, gave him a standing ovation. He came back to the UN in 2020 and again in 2021, each time carrying a message that expanded in scope, from self-love to collective resilience, from individual identity to generational responsibility. No other musician of his generation has been invited to address the UN General Assembly 3 times. Not a single one. Chris Martin, who has been involved in global advocacy for years through partnerships with organizations like Global Citizen and through Coldplay's commitment to environmentally sustainable touring, recognized in RM something that transcended the typical celebrity activism model. This wasn't a pop star lending his face to a cause for good press. This was a thinker who happened to be a pop star, someone who read Haruki Murakami and Hermann Hesse between tour stops, who visited art galleries in every city BTS performed in. Not for Instagram content, but because he genuinely needed to be around beauty and ideas to feed the part of himself that made him right. Namjoon's love for visual art became so well known that museums in Seoul, London, and New York reported measurable spikes in visitor traffic whenever he posted about an exhibition. The RM effect on the art world became an actual studied phenomenon, with curators and gallery owners publicly acknowledging that this one K-pop leader was doing more to bring young people into contemporary art spaces than decades of institutional outreach programs combined. And yet, for all his intellectual weight, RM carries a vulnerability that makes him deeply human and endlessly relatable. In BTS's documentary series, Burn the Stage, there is a scene that has lived in ARMY's collective memory since the moment it aired. Namjoon, sitting alone after a concert where he felt his performance wasn't good enough, breaks down. Not dramatically. Quietly. He talks about the gap between who he is as a leader, the one who has to hold everything together, the one who translates for the group in every international setting, the one who speaks to the UN and does press conferences and carries the narrative weight of an entire cultural movement on his shoulders, and who he is as a person. A person who gets tired. A person who doubts. A person who sometimes wants to just sit in his studio alone with his dog Rapmon and disappear from the enormity of what BTS has become. Chris Martin connected with that fracture between the public leader and the private human on a visceral level. Coldplay's frontman has been candid about the loneliness of leadership within a band, the way every decision, every creative direction, every public misstep ultimately flows back to you, the way the success is shared, but the blame is singular. When Chris Martin talked about RM, he reportedly didn't focus on the UN speeches, or the chart records, or the intellectual dexterity. He focused on something subtler. He focused on the way Namjoon listens. Not hears, listens. The way he processes what other people are saying with his entire being, the way he pauses before responding because he is genuinely considering the other person's perspective rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. In an industry full of people who talk constantly and say nothing, Chris Martin found in RM someone who could sit in silence and make that silence mean more than 1,000 interviews. Namjoon's solo work only deepened that impression. His first official solo album, Indigo, released in December 2022, was not a K-pop album in any conventional sense. It was an autobiographical art project, each track tied to a specific person and period in his life, featuring collaborations with artists as diverse as Erykah Badu, Anderson .Paak, and Eugene from Korean rock band Cherry Filter. The album explored themes of identity, aging, creative burnout, and the terrifying question every artist eventually faces: what happens when the thing that defined you stops being enough? Right Place, Wrong Person, his second solo album in 2024, pushed even further into experimental territory, deliberately moving away from commercial accessibility in favor of artistic honesty, a decision that Chris Martin, who faced massive industry pushback when Coldplay released the experimental Everyday Life album in 2019, deeply respected. RM didn't chase the algorithm. He chased the truth. And in a music landscape increasingly governed by data analytics and playlist optimization, that kind of creative courage is becoming dangerously rare. Chris Martin saw in RM not just a talented musician, not just an intelligent leader, but a prototype for what the next generation of global artists could look like, someone who refuses to separate artistry from intellect, who believes that a pop star has not just the right but the responsibility to engage with the world beyond the stage, and who carries the crushing weight of that belief with a grace that belies the struggle underneath. That's your number 4, and if a multilingual, UN-speaking, art world-shifting, philosophically brilliant leader who redefined what it means to be a pop star in the 21st century only lands at number 4, then the top 3 must be something truly extraordinary. And they are. Because at number 3, we're entering territory where Chris Martin didn't just admire the talent, he was genuinely shaken by it. Shaken by a performer whose ability to convey emotion through movement made Chris Martin say something he has never said about any other artist in his entire career. Breathe. You're going to need it. Number 3. Jimin. The emotional weapon Chris Martin called otherworldly. What does it look like when a human body stops being a body and starts becoming a feeling? Not a metaphor. Not poetic exaggeration. An actual, literal sensation where you watch someone move and your brain cannot reconcile how flesh, bone, and muscle are producing something that registers in your nervous system as pure, undiluted emotion. Chris Martin has seen a lot of performers in his life. He has shared stages with legends, stood backstage watching icons, and spent decades inside an industry that manufactures spectacle on an industrial scale. And yet, when asked about the moment that genuinely left him speechless during his time with BTS, he didn't point to a vocal run or a lyrical revelation. He pointed to the way Park Jimin dances. Specifically, the way Jimin closes his eyes during a performance and moves as if the music isn't something he's hearing through speakers, but something that's being injected directly into his bloodstream, flowing through every capillary, controlling every millimeter of motion from his fingertips to the arch of his feet. Chris Martin reportedly used one word that he has never, and people close to the collaboration emphasize never, used to describe another performing artist in his entire career: otherworldly. Park Jimin was born on October 13, 1995, in Jumjeong District, Busan, South Korea, the country's second largest city, a sprawling port metropolis where the mountains meet the sea and the culture carries a roughness, a directness, a blue-collar honesty that stands in sharp contrast to the polished glamour of Seoul. Jimin didn't grow up surrounded by the entertainment industry. His father was a cafe owner. His family was middle-class, practical, grounded. But even as a child, something about Jimin was different. Not louder, not more attention-seeking, different in the way that artists are different before anyone, including themselves, fully understands why. He enrolled at Busan High School of Arts as a top student in the contemporary dance department, and this is a detail that cannot be overstated because it fundamentally separates Jimin from virtually every other performer in K-pop. Contemporary dance is not idol choreography. Idol choreography is synchronized, sharp, designed to look impressive in formation. Contemporary dance is an entirely different discipline. It's about emotional storytelling through the body, about weight and release, about the space between movements being just as intentional as the movements themselves. It requires not just physical control, but psychological openness, a willingness to be vulnerable in your body in a way that most people are never vulnerable even in their words. Jimin trained in this discipline intensely, and when he auditioned for Big Hit Entertainment, he brought something into that room that the company had never seen in a prospective idol before, the ability to make a dance feel like a confession. He was the last member added to the BTS lineup before their debut, arriving later than the others and immediately facing the pressure of proving he belonged alongside members who had been training together for much longer. That late arrival haunted him. In multiple interviews and BTS group discussions, Jimin has been devastatingly honest about his early years with the group, the relentless self-criticism, the dieting that bordered on dangerous, the nights he practiced the same 8-count sequence 40, 50, 60 times until his body physically couldn't repeat it anymore, and then doing it 10 more times because the version in his head was still more beautiful than the version in the mirror. There is a moment in Burn the Stage, BTS's 2018 YouTube Originals documentary series, that has become one of the most discussed scenes in K-pop documentary history. Jimin, visibly exhausted after a concert, sits in a dimly lit room and says, almost to himself, that he doesn't think he did well enough. The other members push back, telling him he was incredible, that the fans loved it. And Jimin just shakes his head. Not for dramatic effect. Not for the camera. Because in his mind, the performance he delivered and the performance he envisioned were two different things, and the gap between those two versions is where his pain lives. Chris Martin recognized that particular brand of artistic torment instantly. He has talked about Coldplay concerts where 60,000 people were screaming with joy and he walked off stage feeling like a failure because one note in Fix You was half a pitch off, because his piano intro on Clocks didn't have the exact attack he wanted, because the emotion he tried to channel in the bridge of The Scientist felt performative instead of genuine, distinctions that literally no one in the audience would ever notice, but that burned inside him for days afterward. That obsessive, almost masochistic pursuit of an impossible perfection, Jimin has it at a level that startled even Chris Martin. But here is where Jimin transcends the conversation about perfectionism and enters something else entirely. Because when everything aligns, when the preparation meets the moment, when Jimin's body and the music and the emotion collapse into a single unified expression, what happens on that stage is not a performance. It's a possession. His solo Stage 4 Lie during BTS's Wings tour is widely regarded as one of the most artistically significant solo performances in K-pop concert history. The choreography, rooted in contemporary dance vocabulary, tells the story of someone trapped in a web of their own deceptions, pulled between desire and guilt, reaching for freedom and being dragged back by invisible forces. Jimin didn't just dance it. He became it. Every review, every fan account, every reaction video from that era describes the same phenomenon. Watching Jimin perform Lie live felt like witnessing something private, something sacred, something you almost felt guilty for seeing because of how exposed he made himself. And that raw emotional exposure is precisely what Chris Martin identified as Jimin's superpower. In an era of K-pop defined by increasingly complex choreography, knife-sharp synchronization, and athletic spectacle, Jimin does something radical. He prioritizes feeling over form. His movements are technically excellent, but technique is never the point. The point is always the emotion underneath, and Jimin has a supernatural ability to transmit that emotion directly into the audience's chest without any intellectual mediation. You don't think about what Jimin is doing. You feel it. Before your brain can analyze the footwork or the body roll or the way his hand floats upward like it's being lifted by something invisible, the emotion has already landed. It bypassed your eyes and hit your heart. His solo career has only amplified this gift. Face, released in March 2023 as his first solo album, debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200, and lead single, Like Crazy, made him the first Korean solo artist to reach number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song, a dreamy, melancholic track about the intoxicating blur between love and loneliness, was accompanied by a music video that showcased Jimin's ability to act through movement, to tell an entire story with his body in a way that dialogue never could. His second album, Muse, in 2024 pushed further, with the single, Who, becoming a global sensation and proving that Jimin's appeal wasn't a BTS-dependent phenomenon. He was a standalone force. Chris Martin saw all of this potential during those early collaboration sessions, and what struck him most wasn't the dancing itself, but what the dancing revealed about the person doing it. Jimin dances like someone who has no choice. Not in the contractual sense, not in the professional obligation sense, but in the existential sense, like if he stopped moving, something essential inside him would cease to exist. That's not a skill. That's not a talent. That's a calling. And Chris Martin, who has said that writing music is the only thing that makes him feel fully real, who has described songwriting as the only place where all the noise stops, understood exactly what it means to be driven by something you can't name and can't refuse. Jimin doesn't just perform. He surrenders. And watching that surrender, watching someone give themselves so completely to a moment that the boundary between artist and art dissolves, is what made Chris Martin call him otherworldly. That's your number 3. A performer so emotionally devastating that one of rock's greatest frontmen had to invent new vocabulary to describe what he witnessed. And if that's number 3, then the 2 members remaining must have done something truly unthinkable to rank above it. At number 2, we're about to meet the member whose raw, natural artistry hit Chris Martin in a place he didn't expect, not the ears, not the eyes, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere that made him emotional in a way he wasn't prepared for. Keep watching. Number 2. V. The voice from another era that brought Chris Martin to tears. Somewhere in the middle of recording My Universe, when the technical work was done for the day and the studio had emptied out to that late-night skeleton crew of just a few engineers and artists who weren't ready to leave yet, Taehyung started humming. Not a BTS song. Not a Coldplay song. Not anything recognizable at all. Just a low, warm, unhurried melody that seemed to rise from somewhere beneath his ribs, a sound so deep and so impossibly rich that it filled the room the way smoke fills a glass jar, slowly, completely, with nowhere to escape. Chris Martin was still there. He heard it. And according to accounts from people present during those late sessions, what happened next is something that those who witnessed it describe with a kind of reverent disbelief. Chris Martin, the man who has performed in front of millions, who has heard the greatest voices of the last 3 decades up close, who has been moved by music more times than he could possibly count, sat down, listened to Taehyung hum a melody that didn't even have words yet, and his eyes welled up. Not performatively. Not for an audience. There was no camera. There was no moment being manufactured. A 50-year-old rock legend heard a 27-year-old Korean man's voice reverberate through a half-lit studio, and something about that sound reached a place inside him that years of professional experience had taught him to protect. Taehyung V was born on December 30th, 1995, and his origin story reads less like a K-pop trainee biography and more like a folktale about a boy the universe kept trying to redirect toward music no matter how many detours life threw at him. Raised not in the gleaming urban corridors of Seoul or even Daegu, where he was technically born, but in the rural farming countryside of Jeochang, a small, mountainous county in South Gyeongsang province, where rice paddies stretch to the horizon, and the loudest sound on most days is the wind cutting through the valley. Taehyung grew up in a world stripped of glamour. His family were farmers. Not metaphorical, Instagram aesthetic farmers. Real farmers. His grandmother, who played a central role in raising him, worked the land with her hands, and young Taehyung spent his childhood running through fields, catching insects, and developing a relationship with nature and solitude that would later infuse his artistry with a quality that no urban-trained idol could replicate, a groundedness and earthiness, a sense that his voice carries the soil and sky of a place most people will never visit. He never planned to audition for big hit entertainment. The story, now legendary among ARMY, is that Taehyung accompanied a friend to the Daegu auditions purely for moral support. He had no intention of performing. But someone at the audition site, accounts vary on whether it was a staff member or a fellow auditioner, convinced him to try. On a whim, with zero preparation, Kim Taehyung walked into that audition room and sang. And whatever came out of his mouth that day was enough to make Big Hit's team call his father for permission on the spot, because they understood immediately that what this boy had in his throat was not something you could train into existence. You either carried that frequency in your DNA or you didn't. Taehyung did. His voice is a baritone, deep, textured, with a natural vibrato that music critics have compared not to other K-pop vocalists, but to jazz and soul legends from entirely different eras. Dean Martin, Chet Baker, Frank Sinatra in his Capitol Records years. These comparisons aren't hyperbole crafted by enthusiastic fans. They've appeared in professional music publications, in vocal analysis videos by trained coaches, and in the private observations of producers who have worked with him. There is something anachronistic about V's voice, as if it doesn't belong to the 2020s at all. As if it slipped through a crack in time from some smoky 1950s lounge where the microphone was heavy and the audience sat close enough to feel the singer's breath. Chris Martin felt that anachronism immediately. As a musician who grew up worshipping Jeff Buckley, who has cited Tim Buckley and Johnny Cash as foundational influences, who gravitates toward voices that carry the weight of lived experience rather than technical perfection, Chris Martin heard in Taehyung's voice something he hadn't encountered in the modern pop landscape, authenticity that couldn't be engineered. Pro Tools can correct pitch. Vocal coaches can improve technique. Producers can layer harmonies and effects until any voice sounds polished. But the thing that V's voice has, that smoky, amber-toned warmth that feels like it's wrapping around you rather than projecting at you, that cannot be manufactured. It exists because of the specific dimensions of his vocal cords, the unique shape of his resonating chambers, and some intangible spiritual quality that scientists can measure in frequency but cannot explain in meaning. And what makes V's artistry devastating rather than merely impressive is the emotional intelligence he brings to his vocal delivery. Listen to Stigma from BTS's 2016 Wings album, a neo-soul track where Taehyung sings about guilt, shame, and the desperation of trying to hide a painful truth. His voice cracks during the climax. Not because he lost control. Because he chose to let the crack happen, to let the imperfection communicate what a clean note never could, the sound of someone breaking under the weight of something they can't say out loud. That artistic choice, at 20 years old, on a track that would be heard by millions, reveals a performative maturity that most singers don't develop until decades into their careers. Then came Singularity in 2018, the introductory track for BTS's Love Yourself, Tear album, and the performance that accompanied it became one of the most critically discussed solo stages in modern K-pop. Taehyung, alone on stage, wearing a suit, moving with a controlled, almost theatrical sensuality while singing about the masks people wear and the selves they sacrifice in the name of love. The performance drew comparisons to Prince, to David Bowie, to the kind of genre-fluid, gender-fluid artistry that challenges audiences to confront their own assumptions about what a male pop performer is allowed to be. Chris Martin, who has long admired Bowie as one of music's great shapeshifters, saw in V that same willingness to inhabit a character so fully that the boundary between performer and performance becomes meaningless. Taehyung's solo album, Layover, released in September 2023, crystallized everything that makes him unique into a cohesive artistic statement. The album was not K-pop. It was not R&B. It was not jazz. It was some unclassifiable blend of all three, drenched in the kind of late-night, low-light atmosphere that makes you feel like you're listening to someone's most intimate thoughts through a hotel room wall. Tracks like Slow Dancing, Rainy Days, and Love Me Again were built on minimal production, sparse instrumentation, gentle rhythms, and acres of space for Taehyung's voice to exist without competition. The album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200, a remarkable achievement for a project that deliberately rejected every trend in mainstream pop. There were no dance pop bangers, no TikTok-ready hooks, no features designed to game the algorithm. Layover was Taehyung saying, "This is who I am when no one is telling me who to be," and the world responded with open arms. Before Layover, His OST contribution, Sweet Night, for the Korean drama 81 Class had already signaled his ability to connect with audiences on a deeply personal level, reaching #1 on iTunes in over 100 countries. A record at the time with a song so gentle, so tender, so quietly devastating that listeners described it as feeling like a lullaby sung by someone who wasn't sure they'd see you in the morning. Chris Martin understood that Taehyung's power lies not in what he adds to a performance, but in what he strips away. In a musical era obsessed with more production, more features, more spectacle, more noise, V moves in the opposite direction. He subtracts until only the essential remains. One voice, one emotion, one moment of connection between the person singing and the person listening. That's a philosophy Chris Martin has chased throughout Coldplay's career, most visibly on albums like Ghost Stories, where he deliberately pulled back from stadium-sized anthems and wrote small, broken, intimate songs about love falling apart. When Chris Martin describes what makes V special, the technical language disappears. He doesn't talk about range or tone or vocal placement. He talks about feeling. About the way Taehyung's voice makes you remember things you thought you'd forgotten. A specific afternoon, a specific person, a specific shade of light coming through a window at a time in your life when everything felt both beautiful and unbearably temporary. That's not a skill you learn. That's a frequency you transmit because of who you are at your molecular level. And Kim Taehyung transmits it every single time he opens his mouth. That's your #2, a voice so timeless, so hauntingly beautiful, so stripped of pretense that it made one of the most celebrated musicians in modern history cry in an empty studio at midnight. If that's #2, then the member at #1 must represent something beyond talent, beyond artistry, beyond any single category. #1. Jungkook. The once-in-a-generation phenomenon that left Chris Martin questioning reality. Every generation gets one. Just one. One performer who doesn't just master a single discipline but absorbs everything: vocals, dance, stage presence, charisma, athleticism, instinct, emotional range, raw star power, and fuses it all into a single human being so complete, so terrifyingly capable that the people who work alongside him stop comparing him to his peers and start comparing him to eras. Elvis had it. Michael Jackson had it. Prince had it. And when Chris Martin spent extended time with Jungkook during the Coldplay x BTS collaboration, he walked away with a realization that visibly unsettled him, not because it was negative, but because it forced him to recalibrate his entire understanding of what a performer could be in the 21st century. Chris Martin has been in the music industry since 1996. Nearly 3 decades of watching artists rise, peak, fade, and occasionally transcend. In all that time, across all those encounters, he has been measured with his superlatives. He doesn't throw around words like greatest or best because he understands the weight those words carry when they come from someone at his level. But with Jungkook, the restraint cracked. Something about this kid, and when they first met, Jungkook was still in his mid-20s, younger than some of the roadies on Coldplay's crew, made Chris Martin abandon caution and say plainly that Jungkook was one of the most naturally gifted performers he had ever encountered in his life. Not in K-pop. Not in his generation. In his life. Born on September 1st, 1997, in Mandeokdong, Busan, Jungkook's origin story has achieved almost mythological status in the global music community, and for good reason, because it begins with failure. In 2011, a 13-year-old Jungkook auditioned for Superstar K3, one of South Korea's biggest televised singing competitions. He didn't make it. He was eliminated early, a forgettable face among hundreds of hopeful kids with big dreams and shaky voices. That should have been the end. For most people, it would have been. But what happened next became one of the most consequential moments in modern music history. 7 different entertainment companies contacted Jungkook after his audition, having seen something in his brief television appearance that the judges missed. 7 companies. He was 13 years old and had 7 doors suddenly open in front of him. He chose Big Hit Entertainment, the smallest, the least prestigious, the one with the fewest resources and the most uncertain future. He chose it because of one person. He chose it because he watched a young rapper named Namjoon perform during the audition process, and something about RM's energy, RM's charisma, RM's magnetic command of a room made a 13-year-old boy from Busan think, I want to follow that person. That decision, a child's instinct, nothing more, would alter the trajectory of global popular music. Jungkook arrived at Big Hit as a shy, nearly silent teenager who couldn't maintain eye contact with strangers and cried during his first weeks in Seoul because he missed his family. The other trainees noticed two things about him almost immediately. First, he was extraordinarily quiet. Second, he was extraordinarily good at everything he tried. Singing? His vocal coaches were stunned by the natural power and clarity of his voice at an age when most boys were still navigating the chaos of vocal mutation. Dancing? He absorbed choreography at a speed that frustrated trainees who had been dancing for years. Rapping? Not his primary focus, but when he tried it, he was competent within weeks. Athletics? He could outrun, outjump, and outperform every member of the group in virtually every physical challenge, earning the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his career, the Golden Maknae. In Korean culture, Maknae means the youngest member of a group. Golden was added because nothing seemed to be beyond his reach. And normally, that kind of label would feel like hyperbole, the kind of affectionate exaggeration fandoms attach to their favorites. Except with Jungkook, the evidence is so overwhelming, so relentlessly stacked, that the nickname almost feels insufficient. By the time Chris Martin met him, Jungkook had already demonstrated his vocal capacity on tracks like Euphoria, a soaring, sunlit pop song that required him to sustain high notes with a breathy, almost ethereal quality that vocal coaches have analyzed in educational videos as technically remarkable. He had performed My Time during BTS's Map of the Soul tour, a solo stage that showcased R&B vocal runs, intricate choreography, and a seductive stage presence that bore zero resemblance to the shy boy who cried in a Seoul dormitory at 13. He had covered songs by artists ranging from Charlie Puth to Justin Bieber to Adam Levine on his personal social media, each cover accumulating tens of millions of views, not because of the BTS brand, but because his interpretations were genuinely, undeniably exceptional. What Chris Martin witnessed during the My Universe sessions was the thing that separates Jungkook from the merely talented, the speed at which he processes and adapts. Multiple sources from the recording sessions describe a moment where Chris Martin suggested a subtle melodic variation on one of Jungkook's lines, a different way of approaching a phrase, a slight rhythmic shift inspired by Coldplay's style. Jungkook listened once, nodded, stepped back into the recording booth, and delivered the variation on the first take. Not close to what Chris Martin suggested. Exactly what he suggested, with an emotional nuance that somehow improved on the original idea. Chris Martin stood behind the mixing console and said nothing for several seconds, then turned to one of the producers and asked, quietly, "Does he always do that?" The answer, of course, was yes. So there it is. All seven members of BTS, ranked through the lens of one of the most accomplished musicians alive, a man who has nothing to gain from flattery, nothing to prove through association, and no reason to exaggerate his admiration for a group that operates in an entirely different musical universe from Coldplay. And yet Chris Martin didn't just acknowledge BTS. He studied them. He sat with each of them, watched them work, listened to their stories, felt their energy, and came away with something that transformed a professional collaboration into a genuine, lasting respect. Let's take a breath and look at what this list actually reveals. At number 7, Jin showed us that vulnerability and persistence can turn a so-called weakness into an instrument of pure emotional transparency, earning the recognition of a man who wrote some of rock's most heartbreaking ballads. At number 6, J-Hope proved that stage energy isn't something you perform, it's something you are, an electric current running through your DNA that reminded Chris Martin of the first time music made him feel truly alive. At number 5, Suga demonstrated that songwriting at its highest level isn't about melody, it's about truth, the kind of unflinching, life-saving truth that made Chris Martin go silent with recognition. At number 4, RM redefined what a pop star could be, not just an entertainer, but a thinker, a leader, a bridge between cultures, and a voice at the United Nations that made the world's most powerful people stand up and listen. At number 3, Jimin shattered the boundary between dance and emotion, moving with such otherworldly expressiveness that Chris Martin used a word he had never used for any other artist in his career. At number 2, V carried a voice from another era, timeless, haunting, stripped of every artifice, and that voice, hummed in an empty studio at midnight, brought one of rock's greatest frontmen to tears. And at number 1, Jungkook stood as the once-in-a-generation phenomenon, the golden magne who doesn't just excel in every category, but redefines what's possible when every gift converges in a single human being. Here's the thing that makes this story bigger than a celebrity endorsement. Chris Martin didn't have to say any of this. Coldplay was already one of the biggest bands in the world before My Universe. BTS was already a global phenomenon. Neither side needed the other for validation. But when Chris Martin spoke about these 7 men, he wasn't marketing. He wasn't networking. He was bearing witness. Bearing witness to the reality that somewhere in South Korea, a small entertainment company assembled 7 boys from different cities, different backgrounds, different temperaments, and different dreams. And those 7 boys grew into 7 artists who collectively represent every dimension of what musical greatness can look like. From the farmer's grandson who sings like a jazz legend from the 1950s, to the street dancer from Gwangju who ignites every stage he touches. From the underground rapper who turned his depression into lifelines for millions, to the leader who speaks to the United Nations about the courage of self-love. From the eldest young who proved that late bloomers can outshine everyone, to the contemporary dancer who makes audiences feel emotions they can't name, to the youngest member who looked at every category of performance and said, "I'll take all of them." That's BTS. That's why Chris Martin spoke out. And that's why, when one of music's most respected voices says, "incredible talent," he isn't exaggerating. He's understating it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications because this is just the beginning.